This podcast is unusually long for State of Tel Aviv because we look carefully at what happened and what did not last Thursday night in Amsterdam, and before and since. We will be following how the Jew Hunt, as the local vigilantes and taxi drivers called it in their chat groups, how the Jew Hunt is addressed by municipal and national leaders and community leadership. In addition to much of the international media blaming the Jews pretty much instantly for having brought upon themselves this savagery, a local Palestinian man, a community leader, spoke with an Egyptian television station shortly after the Jew Hunt and declared that it was all a crafty plot hatched by the Mossad to generate sympathy among Europeans for Israel. And he's serious. Many people believe this stuff too. You can watch for yourself. The clip is referenced in the podcast notes. Given the length of this special podcast, we expect that you may wish to listen in installments, and so we also provide timestamps for each of the 3 interviews in the notes below. This immersion in Amsterdam, of course, is about much more than one city. I see this as a significant turning point in the Western capitulation to Islamists. Amsterdam and the Netherlands, which perceive themselves to be exceedingly tolerant societies, have lost control over their streets and institutions. The pogrom that went down last week, when Israelis and Jews were chased into alleyways and beaten, thrown into canals, where a receptionist at one hotel at least gave to the pro-Hamas thugs room numbers of Israelis, and they were then beaten inside their sanctuary, where the police stood aside and watched. They did not intervene. When panicked Israelis asked for help, they said, just stay in large groups and go back to your hotel. Taxi drivers participated in organized online chat groups, one reportedly with more than 700 participants. They provided information to the roving thugs who were zipping around Amsterdam on electric bikes and doing hit-and-run attacks on small groups of people who they identified as being Jewish or Israeli. If someone with an Israeli phone number ordered a taxi or a rideshare, then the drivers would provide the location to the Jew hunters, who showed up instead to beat the passengers. The police have since tried to explain their passivity as being a result of the challenge of keeping up with speedy and agile two-wheeled attackers. But that's some pretty thin gruel they're serving up, particularly in light of another bit of information that one of our guests gets into. The fact that in recent months, perhaps longer, this has been covered in the Dutch press. Some Muslim police officers in Amsterdam have refused to take any shift that may require them to protect or secure a Jewish institution, like the Holocaust Museum, or a synagogue, or a school. Yes, you heard that correctly. What else do we know? We know that Israeli authorities forewarned the Dutch of an urgent need for enhanced security around the Thursday night soccer game and parts of the city where Israelis were known to frequent. That seems to have been the flashpoint for all this activity, the soccer game. And we know that those warnings, at least 3 in the days leading up to the soccer match, were ignored. They certainly were not heeded. We know this because the Dutch Minister of Justice, David van Wiel, has admitted as much, and earlier this week took the extraordinary step of sending a letter to the Dutch Parliament, confirming that an investigation was underway on an urgent basis to sort out what went wrong. Why was the city not at all prepared for this explosion of violence? On Friday morning, I awoke to the first reports of the Amsterdam pogrom. It had been a memorable week. President-elect Trump won the U.S. election on Tuesday. As we waited for those results, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu fired Israel's Minister of Defense, Yoav Gallant. And then, Amsterdam. This is one of those moments in time where you pay attention to what is going down in broad daylight. I wanted to go a little deeper on this podcast for several reasons, but one is personal. Amsterdam is a very special city for me. When I was in my 20s, which more or less coincided with the 80s, my parents lived there for about 7 years. I spent a lot of time in Amsterdam and came to know and love the place. Things were different then. Amsterdam then was famous for having legal pot and the red light district. It all seems so simple and innocent today. I lived in the real Amsterdam then, a small city with remarkable culture, style, and quirks. I cycled for hours on bike trails to the south of the city, through those postcard Dutch farming villages, and it was all flat as a pancake. Easy riding. Because I spoke German reasonably well in those days, I was also able to understand more Dutch than I expected. But most Amsterdammers, even then, spoke English quite well. But things were changing back then, and quickly. Immigration to the Netherlands from Morocco and Turkey was picking up at that time in the 80s. Many newcomers were Muslim and brought with them very different beliefs and culture. The Dutch are stoic and tolerant. Perhaps they accommodated the newcomers' preferences to a fault. The results were on full display last week and have been since. Since Friday morning, I have spoken with many people with strong connections to the Netherlands. In this podcast, we focus on 3. It is a varied trio, each one having strong ties to the country and the city. We begin with Pieter Dorsman, a Dutch-Canadian who has lived most of his adult life in Vancouver. After relocating to Hong Kong from the Netherlands early in his career, he and his wife settled in Vancouver, seeing it as a beautiful place in which to work and raise a family. Pieter happened to be in the Netherlands visiting his family when the pogrom broke out. His insights are heartbreaking. Pieter is not Jewish, in case you are wondering. Like Pieter Dorsman, our second conversation is with another Dutchman who chose to relocate in adulthood. David De Bruijn is a professor of philosophy at the University of Auburn in Auburn, Alabama, which is a long, long way in so many ways from The Hague, where he grew up. David's siblings and extended family remain in the Netherlands. He brings the perspective of a Jewish man who experienced overt antisemitism growing up. For him, it was just the way things were. David very purposefully left the Netherlands. He saw what was coming and decided that he wanted no part of that future. In the last segment, I speak with Eitam Zach, a 27-year-old Israeli man who left the country right after completing his army service and has since studied in The Hague, where he completed his first degree. For his master's, Eitam moved to Amsterdam. Openly queer and ambitious, Eitam is shocked, and not, at what has transpired recently, and also at the way things shifted following October 7th. We discuss the hostility and support he has encountered, and whether he feels safe in his own home. As mentioned earlier, Amsterdam is a city that prides itself on a long tradition of tolerance. But it seems that the mayor and other leaders have really lost the plot. In fairness, the situation has been decades in the making. Responsibility must be shared with those who have led the city down a slippery slope. To anyone paying attention to the social fabric of Amsterdam and the Netherlands generally, since the 80s, the current situation should surprise no one. David De Bruijn saw this coming, and he's not alone. It is human nature to look away, to reassure ourselves that it's not that bad. This too will pass. But we don't always have a Disney ending. This time, it will not pass. And this time, like in the past, it is not just Amsterdam where Jews are being hunted, where law enforcement is looking the other way, where Islamists rule not only on the streets, but in many institutions that set the tone and rules for our society. In Europe and my home country, Canada in particular, there is a difference between tolerance and capitulation. In the podcast notes, we have also set out relevant articles written by our guests and a few by me on the pogrom and important moments leading up to it in recent history. I am recording this on Wednesday morning, Israel time. That's 7 hours ahead of Eastern time. On Monday night, Muslim men in Amsterdam were rioting. Again, in another show of Free Palestine force. In addition to throwing bricks and other objects at police officers, and, well, anyone who got in their way, the rioters also set alight at least one tram. On Tuesday, the mayor of Amsterdam, representing the Green Party, held an emergency session with her city council and other key municipal officials. Her continued use of the term pogrom has angered many in Amsterdam. That is showing itself to have a strong anti-Semitic bent just under the surface. Many council members are taking the position that the pogrom was caused by the ugly behavior of a small number of Israeli soccer fans, which apparently justifies a violent Jew hunt. The Jew hunt is threatening to repeat in other European cities. Israel has warned its citizens to avoid attending soccer matches in Europe and to be very vigilant when they travel. Just last night, a warning was issued to all Israelis in Thailand to hide their identity and leave the country as soon as possible. Apparently, there are serious terror threats against Israelis and Jews there as well. A copycat Jew hunt planned for Antwerp has also been shut down. For now. This is not going away. Not this time. I'm Vivian Berkovich, former Canadian ambassador to Israel, and now going down the rabbit hole of Amsterdam, Antwerp, and so many cities in Europe and Canada, hoping for the best, but braced for the not so great. We begin with Pieter Dorsman. Saturday, November 9th. Good afternoon, Pieter Dorsman. How are you today?
I'm very well. Thank you for inviting me and talking to you, Vivian.
It's so beyond, I was going to say it's my pleasure, but I'm going to change that to I'm so pleased to be able to have you today on State of Tel Aviv and talk to you in depth about what has been going on in Amsterdam over the last few days. But of course, we're going to go further back in history. But first, Pieter, I'd like to just introduce you to the listeners so they have some idea of who you are and why we're talking. So Pieter Dorsman, an acquaintance of mine, a Dutch Canadian living in Vancouver who just happens to be visiting family right now in the Netherlands, in the Rotterdam area. And we've been corresponding on WhatsApp over the last few days about this horrific pogrom that erupted in Amsterdam on Thursday night. You live in Vancouver now, and you are a bit of a globetrotter and enjoy what's out there to be discovered and learned. But you have a storied career in banking, venture capital. You've spent many years in Hong Kong, I believe, as well, before deciding to put down roots in Vancouver and raise your family in what was then a quite sane and stable country, Canada.
That's correct. Things have changed quite a bit.
Everywhere.
Yeah.
Sleepy little Canada, huh? Anyhow. So let's just get right into it. You also have a Substack, which is exceptional. And for all our listeners, I will be recommending specific articles in the podcast notes where Pieter has written about in the past incidents that are directly relevant to what we're talking about today. But let's get to Thursday night. You're saying no surprise that this vicious pogrom erupted in Amsterdam in the way it did. Why?
There's a number of things at play here. Let's go back to October 7th and what's happening in all the streets from Toronto, New York, Paris, London, Amsterdam. There is these violent pro-Hamas rallies, which have, initially was a fringe group, but it has spilled over into the mainstream population and mainstream, in particular, immigrant communities in Western European cities. And the Netherlands has a very large Muslim contingent of immigrants, right? In particular from Morocco and Turkey as well. A lot of the youngsters have not connected with Dutch society, haven't integrated, and have reverted to crime, violence, and radical political and Islamist positions. So the protests, as I've seen them in the Netherlands, have grown with, these components added into the mix. So if an Israeli team is coming to visit a city like Amsterdam, and it's a city that has a very deep Jewish background, right? The nickname for Amsterdam is Mokum, coming from Makom, right? Place, right? I grew up in a generation that would call Amsterdam Mokum.
Pieter refers to the nickname in the past for Amsterdam among locals, the word Mokum, which is very similar to the Yiddish and Hebrew words for place. Since the Spanish Inquisition in 1492, when many Jews were expelled from Spain and Portugal, there has been a significant and continuous Jewish population in Amsterdam. The community also drew large numbers of Jews from Eastern Europe over the centuries. And when Hitler came to power in Germany in 1933, many German Jews emigrated to the Netherlands. They believed they would be safe there, but the respite was brief. Among this wave of German émigrés was the family of Anne Frank, the young Jewish teenager who hid in an attic for 2 years with her family and others, and was ultimately betrayed to the Nazis. Anne Frank died a miserable death in the final days of World War II, starved and diseased. Her iconic diary and the preservation of the annex as the family hideout in central Amsterdam has become known, have made Anne one of the most recognized of the 6 million European Jews to have been murdered by the Nazis and their collaborators. 140,000 men, women, and children, comprising 75% of the Dutch Jewish population in the Netherlands, were murdered during the Holocaust. This statistic is very high for an occupied Western country, and one which the Dutch people have worked hard to understand and forget. As in all occupied countries, the Dutch have a dual history of resistance to Nazis and collaboration with them. The dichotomy in wartime is brutal, and we have to remember that. Many people were given an ultimatum by the Germans to tell where Jews were hiding or be murdered themselves. And sometimes their families were threatened as well. Those who protected their Jewish compatriots were beyond brave, beyond righteous. We must never forget that. They were heroic. To this day, who betrayed Anne Frank and why they did so remains a mystery. But there were many who kept the secret and risked their lives to protect this family every single day for 2 years. Now, back to Pieter Dorsman, who gets into Wednesday and Thursday last week.
So, large Jewish presence in Amsterdam, Israeli supports coming in, but also a sizable contingent of Muslim gangs and pro-Hamas supporters, all congregating on, let's say, a Thursday in Amsterdam. And around the football match, these supporters, they arrive early, right? You come in on Wednesday and they would leave on Friday, Saturday. They go drinking, they go partying. Soccer in Europe, is pretty violent. There's hooligans, right? Lots of hooligans fight, different clubs fight with each other. North American audiences will not be that familiar with it, but, it can get very violent in soccer in Europe.
They take their soccer very seriously in Europe in the way that North Americans, particularly in Canada, might take their hockey or their football. But we don't get into brawls.
And the brawls are pretty violent, There's casualties, there's lots of police always. And, there was a bit of but the funny thing here is that Israeli supporters coming into Amsterdam, they were not going to sort of brawl with the Ajax supporters, because the Ajax supporters are very pro-Israel, given the Jewish roots of Ajax Amsterdam.
Pieter is referring to the peculiar connection between Ajax and the Jewish community. And just in case you think I'm mispronouncing the team's name, it is spelled, but not pronounced, like the popular North American household cleaner, Ajax. But they say Ajax. One of the team's star players, Eddie Hamel, was murdered in Auschwitz. As the Netherlands reckoned with the impact of the Nazi occupation in the post-war decades, Ajax had on its roster several Jewish soccer stars. It became known in the country as the Jewish team. So when Ajax played matches, and keep in mind that the hooligan soccer culture in Europe is very much a thing, at Ajax games, the opposing team would chant vicious anti-Semitic slurs. After all, it is the Jewish team. We'll hear more about that in the discussion next with David De Bruijn. But the response of Ajax fans has always been to drape themselves in the Israeli flag and sing bar mitzvah staples like Hava Nagila. Are they Jewish? No. Are they politically pro-Israel? No. It's just a weird outcome of soccer world. But they don't hate Israel or Jews either. And so, before and after the Ajax Maccabi game, in which Maccabi, by the way, was trounced 5-0, fans of both teams, Maccabi and Ajax, were dancing in the streets of Amsterdam and singing their very Jewish, not Jewish chants. One more comment on the Ajax-Jewish connection. Salo Muller, who was the team's physiotherapist for decades and is considered to be a pioneer of advancing sport physiotherapy. Salo Muller was a child survivor of the Holocaust, hidden in 9 different homes. His parents and extended family were murdered by Germans. But Salo also held the Dutch state responsible, to a degree. And later in life, he sued the Dutch railway company for having colluded with the Nazis in transporting Jews to their deaths. The case settled out of court in 2018. Muller passed away in 2023. There is an article on this extraordinary lawsuit in the podcast notes, which Muller launched in 2015 after having found incriminating documents. And then there's Michael van Praag, the chairman of Ajax team from 1989 to 2003. He was also a soccer referee and president of the Royal Dutch Football Association from 2008 to 2019. These are all very big deals. His family has long and deep roots in the Netherlands. Michael's father, Jaap, was the sole survivor of a large Dutch Jewish family. So there is this weird backdrop, these threads woven into the Ajax story, which is kind of bizarre and important to understand the current climate and why the Ajax-Maccabi match was the focus of so much rage among Dutch Muslims. One more thing. The population of the Netherlands today is 17 million. 5% are Muslim. However, in Amsterdam, with just under 1 million people, 12% of the population is Muslim. And you mentioned the younger Muslim population not having integrated. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding, based on what I've read and seen, is that most of these people have actually been born in the Netherlands. They're Dutch.
That's true. That's true.
So it's not unlike the situation that we certainly saw in past decades in Germany with respect to the Turks, that many came, they sort of self-isolated in their own communities, did not integrate into the, and also we have the banlieues, they call them, in France on the outskirts of Paris, high concentration of Muslim immigrants. And what we're seeing is that the first generation born in the European country is actually becoming more entrenched in an extreme Islamist culture than their parents came with, correct?
That's correct. A certain percentage, I don't know, there's a number of them that does integrate, but a large, sizable chunk does not integrate in the way we would like them to be. And they see their home country and their religion as, their identity. They hate Dutch society. You hear these comments, et cetera, et cetera. So it's always been a tough issue in the Netherlands. In fact, for my Substack, I wrote about Theo van Gogh murder in Amsterdam 20 years ago. This week, Wolfsland. The issue has been around for quite a while, and the can has been kicked down the road, right? It's never been properly resolved.
I'm shocked to hear that Theo van Gogh's murder 20 years ago, because to me it feels like yesterday. For listeners who are not aware of what that was, I'm going to ask Pieter to explain that in very briefly in just a moment, who he was and what happened. There's also Ayaan Hirsi Ali, who was a Dutch citizen and member of parliament for a short time, right, who is speaking out very strongly with respect to what's going on in the Netherlands these days. And it all just kind of really ties together and brings us to this crescendo. I'm not sure it's the ultimate crescendo, but Thursday night was certainly a crescendo. Tell us a bit about Theo van Gogh.
Theo van Gogh was a Dutch movie maker, a very controversial guy who, said everything that came up in his mind. He was a joker, a jester. He attacked everyone, including Jews. There was actually one noted Jewish writer, Leon de Winter, who actually sued him for his comments. And he would attack Christians and he would attack Muslims. He was anti-religion. He was the ultimate liberal guy. And he made a movie together with Ayaan Hirsi Ali on the submission of women in Islam. And that triggered some radical Islamists in the Netherlands. One of them proceeded to kill him in broad daylight after he had dropped off his son in school in typical Dutch way on his bike, cycled back to his home. He was shot. The killer then proceeded to slice his neck off and put a pin on his body, saying, Ayaan Hirsi Ali will go under, the Netherlands will go under, Europe will go under, Israel will go under, the United States will go under. And that to many people was an indication of, the deeper sentiments behind radical Islam, right? It was not just about Jews, it was about Western society, Western liberal world as we know it, and indicating, change will come. What happened in Dutch society, though, is, and there were some debates last week over it on the 20th year anniversary, is like a lot of people started to self-censor a bit, to become way more careful in what they say and what they write and what they do, because the repercussions are lethal.
And we've seen this kind of extreme action, as in murder, in other places in Europe. We saw it, of course, in Paris with the Charlie Hebdo murders, the satirical magazine. There was a Danish cartoonist who was pushed into hiding. We have Salman Rushdie, the writer, and there are many more examples. So people being silenced in this kind of, context is quite understandable. People are afraid for their lives. Yeah. There was the French teacher, recall, just a few years ago, there was a French history teacher.
Samuel Paty. Yep.
Exactly, who was beheaded outside his school. It is real, this phenomenon, this trend. It's been kind of escalating in Europe now for decades, but it does seem that we're at a bit of a turning point, and which is why this happened and why we're not totally shocked. So let's go just back in time, because you're such a trove of historical information and context. And one thing I think we desperately need when something like this happens is a real understanding of the complexity. Europe is complicated. And the Netherlands, of course, has every country, every little city, every town has a rich, long, and complicated history. Tell us the history of Ajax.
Yeah. Well, Ajax Amsterdam is one of the world's most renowned football clubs. They came to extreme prominence in the 1970s under players like Johan Cruyff. They dominated European soccer. They became an institution, actually a cultural institution. New York Yankees, like the whole world knows about them. They were not Jewish. They were not a Jewish club per se, but they had a lot of famous Jewish players like Eddie Hemel before the war, who was cast in Auschwitz. And after the war, famous players in the golden years of Ajax, Benny Muller, Jacques Zwart, guys like that. And the chairman of the club was Jaap van Praag. He was a well-known Jewish businessman. He lost most of his family in the Holocaust. His son, Michael van Praag, became chairman in the 90s. And another famous guy that I do want to mention, he was a physiotherapist, and he became the most famous Dutch physiotherapist. He lost his parents in the war as well. And he was actually the guy who proceeded to sue the Dutch railways for their complicity in the Holocaust. Case that the Dutch railways, like it's a crown corporation, like government owned, settled like 5 or 6 years ago, right? 70 years after the war. And Salom Muller proceeded that relentlessly. Anyway, I digress. So the club has a real Jewish tradition and a lot of Jewish players that were involved. That was picked up by the supporters in a way by hooligans from other sides. They started calling Amsterdam the Jews, and with the terrible stuff happening, well, let's gas the Jews. So you're sitting in the stadium in another city and the entire city was saying, let's gas the Jews. The Ajax supporters took that up as a badge of honor and they said, okay, we're the Jews. So they started taking Israeli flags to the stadium, singing Hava Nagila, which again was on Dam Square on Thursday. The Maccabi supporters and Ajax supporters dancing together, singing Hava Nagila. Yeah. Most of Jewish people involved with Ajax were not that happy with it. They said, we've lost people in the Holocaust. We don't want, this Jewishness, the whole Jewish chapter to become part of the story in this way, because, it escalates, it brings out antisemitism. So, but the club has a very rich Jewish history, and that plays into this as well, of course.
It is important to pause for a moment and explain what Pieter refers to as the uneasiness of, in this case, the Jewish physiotherapist and what other Dutch Jews feel regarding the way in which many Ajax fans have developed this kind of extreme philo-Semitic identity. Many European Jews have grown up and lived in a prolonged state of trauma. They are the surviving shards of once large families. Most have little or no extended family. No cousins, no grandparents. Generations were slaughtered in the Holocaust, and it takes generations to recover. Those that remain are hesitant to be publicly Jewish, to be loud and proud, so to speak. It's not that they are ashamed, but they have absorbed and learned a culture of treading softly, not drawing attention to oneself, particularly not one's Jewishness. And so you have this very exuberant Dutch fan base that waves Israeli flags and adopts Hava Nagila as a home chant. But for them, it's all soccer. Nevertheless, they certainly are loud and proud. And so are Israelis. Israelis did not grow up in the diaspora, where many Jewish children were taught to work hard, get good grades, and you got it, not draw too much attention to themselves. Israelis are the opposite. They are loud and proud. They are warriors, modern-day Maccabis. They defend a nation that has been at war from day one. They don't hide. They don't cower. And they absolutely do not understand anti-Semitism in the diaspora in a real way. Fun fact, there's a sign at Ben Gurion Airport, and it's only in Hebrew, after one clears passport control, and it says, "Behave. You represent all of us when you are abroad." In other words, dial it down. Israelis seem to fail to comprehend that they are not just tourists when abroad. Everything they do and do not do is scrutinized differently than it might be for, say, some bloke from New Zealand. It is what it is. For most Israelis, the aftermath of October 7th, the Jew-hating backlash that exploded globally overnight, the celebration of the Hamas attack, while the savage rampage was still ongoing, that raw, feral Jew hatred was a profound shock to the nation. Now, back to Pieter to continue sketching out the broader context of anti-Semitism in Amsterdam and the Netherlands. I want to sort of round out the picture as much as possible as we lead up to this horrific Thursday night. There was also significant controversy in May when President Herzog was invited to Amsterdam for the opening of a new Holocaust museum.
That's correct, yeah.
Tell us what happened then.
Okay, so the Holocaust Museum opened. Herzog was part of the visiting party for the formalities, the ceremony. The Dutch king was there. And, like Thursday, and like whenever there's an Israeli or a Jewish event happening, a pro-Hamas crowd, will find a way to protest. Now, think about it, that if you have to do that, you need to get some sort of permission from the city government. And the city government, it's important for the rest of the story, is called the triangle. So that's the mayor, the chief prosecutor, and the chief of police. So they will assess the risk and they say the protest can go ahead. In the case of the Holocaust Museum, they allowed the pro-Hamas, pro-Palestinian crowd to protest because they said it's their constitutional right to do so. Now, that's one thing. But there's also the argument of where do you put them? You can put them like 10 blocks away, or you can put them like right next to where the ceremony, which is what happened. So you saw Holocaust survivors together with the king opening the museum, and you could hear people screaming, and this is a very Dutch term. They use cancer as an epitaph, and it's like cancer Jews go home, right? At the moment that the Holocaust Museum was opened. And that was a phenomenal mistake by Amsterdam's mayor, Femke Halsema. She should have assessed it and said, whatever, your constitutional right to protest, there's limits to it. And there's even in the Dutch law, there's limits. Go somewhere else or do it, even better, do it on another day in another area. They didn't do it. And they repeated that mistake on October 7th this year when there was a ceremony on the Dam Square. They again allowed a pro-Hamas crowd, which was violent, to protest right near. And this was a memorial, right? It was not an October 7th protest. It was a memorial of what happened on the day, to be disrupted by these crowds. So again, she made the same mistake. And then she was on TV and said, well, there's a constitutional right to demonstrate, to protest. But even if I were to sort of disallow it and cancel it as a mayor, I would still have to contend with European law, the rights that people have under the European Constitution. So if you want to understand why people are critics of the European Union, this is a great example.
Saying that the right to protest, which is your mayor invoked a constitutional right to protest. We're both Canadian citizens, and we've heard our Prime Minister Justin Trudeau incessantly since October 7th, 2023, refer to the disgusting scenes that we've seen and violence throughout Canada since that time as peaceful protesters exercising their constitutional right to protest and to express themselves freely. As you state with respect to the Netherlands, yes, we have constitutional provisions, but they're balanced.
That's right.
They're not absolute. It doesn't mean you just get to go out and do whatever the heck you want, whenever, wherever, and say whatever you want. And there seems to be a kind of persistent or consistent quality, which is that the mayor doesn't think that it's necessary or appropriate, or maybe somehow some law somewhere prevents her from telling the police to cordon off an area so that it's safe and respectful.
To your point, there's always the public security argument in which you could override the constitutional rights, right? So there's public security risk because these protesters are violent, right? It can lead to riot, which is what happened, right? Halsema's philosophy is Amsterdam is a multicultural city. I have to balance the needs and requirements of each community, be it Jews, be it Muslims, be it Hindus, be it Ukrainians, wherever. It's a very, it's like New York or Toronto, right? It's a dynamic city so she treats everyone equal, in each group equal. And so in her mind, she has to give the equal rights to the pro-Hamas, the Muslims, and pro-Palestinian supporters, right? And yesterday she went out and she went hugging with the Jewish community, and I'm sorry, and we feel your pain. But this is the public boilerplate that you hear in Canada all the time. Oh, we stand together against hate. We feel your pain. But these are words. There's no action. And that's the core of the issue. She's been unwilling to take real action, and this is now the third time. In addition to which, and I mentioned that briefly to you yesterday, some Jewish police officers came out in the press like 5 or 6 weeks ago saying there's a number of police officers with a Muslim background who have indicated that they don't want to participate in doing security or protective work when there's Jews or Jewish objects involved. You have a moral issue with that. That completely blew up in the Dutch press and in Dutch politics to the national level. And in that case, they came down very clearly. If you're a public servant, you serve the common good. And if you're a Muslim police officer, you have to protect Jewish sites and vice versa. And you have to do your duty. And if you don't like it, resign, go somewhere else. And then some police officers, senior police, made a comment, well, we can work with schedules. We reschedule people. Well, if you're going to do that, you're going to give in. What's the use of having a police force that will, it's assigned and work based on their ideological or religious preferences? It's crazy, right? Again, happened in Amsterdam. So I would say there's been 4 big incidents this year that have landed on Halsema's desk, and she has not responded very well to it. And there's going to be an emergency debate in Amsterdam City Council, I believe, Tuesday, and around the same time in the Dutch National Parliament, it's going to be an emergency debate. Prime Minister came home. He was in Hungary for a meeting from a summit. So he's come home. He's not going to the climate summit that's happening. So there's going to be a lot of political theater and drama next week in the Netherlands, because this will have far-reaching consequences.
Pieter, just set the stage with respect to the larger political sort of context. In the Netherlands, we have Femke Halsema, who sounds like a sort of left-leaning liberal, very deeply rooted tradition in the Netherlands. But you also have a competing kind of tribe, and I think it's probably not unfair to say that might be represented by Geert Wilders, who seemed to triumph in the national elections that were held in the Netherlands, if I remember correctly. But just tell us what happened with the coalition building, who the prime minister is, and what the current national government stands for ideologically.
Okay, so this is the most right-of-center government that Dutch has ever had, in my lifetime at least. Geert Wilders resoundingly won the elections. For ease of reference, he's basically the Dutch Trump. His career actually got launched, more or less, around the same time that Theo van Gogh got murdered. He has been critical of immigration, Islam. He's been under police protection 24/7 ever since then. He won big. He became the
Wow, for 20 years?
20 years. He's been living in a safe house with his wife. So he was designated by constitutional tradition to become the prime minister. In the Netherlands system is very much similar to the Israeli system, right? A fractured parliament, proportional representation, like 12 or 13 parties. You need at least four parties to make a working coalition happen. So the other more right of center parties had no choice but to collaborate with Wilders' party, who is now the largest party, but they didn't want to have Wilders as prime minister. So that was a negotiation of 6 months until that coalition came into place after the election, but they made it work. All the party leaders of the constituent parties of the coalition stayed in parliament. The prime minister was a guy they recruited. He was a high-ranking, actually security official in the Dutch government who was respected. He was a compromise figure, a guy who was good in managing sort of the process, who had lots of connections, and less controversial than Wilders. So this coalition has been fighting over the big issues: immigration, the whole farmer, European climate file, crime, international politics, and there were a number of other local scandals. So it's an uneasy coalition. They don't like each other all that much, but they're making it work because there's no alternative. If an election were held today, Wilders would be even larger. And the left is not growing a lot. So like the United States, the Dutch have moved firmly right. But it is a coalition government. Now, Wilders is in parliament, not in government, but he's the power behind the throne, right? He sort of gives direction, among us using Twitter, much like Trump, to the prime minister and other senior government officials, which direction things should be going. He has, for instance, been calling for Halsema's resignation relentlessly throughout the year. So that is his role. He's influential. And we have a pretty right-of-center government as a result, and they're working hard. But even what happened on Thursday night, they were caught, by surprise, and they were really struggling to give an answer.
So Wilders, he sits in the Dutch parliament, no cabinet position, but pretty much the power behind the throne.
Exactly. Yeah. That's what
in Israeli politics, we are certainly familiar with that concept. So we have this kind of interesting government where the right wing in the Netherlands is more powerful than any other ideological bloc, let's say. And I expect there will be really interesting fireworks this week in the parliament when these issues are discussed. But we'll wait for this week, and maybe we'll have you back on soon, because I think we're going to have all eyes on Amsterdam and on the Netherlands for some time now. But let's do Thursday night, which was really messy. So we have Maccabi Tel Aviv, which is a huge, very popular team in Israel, playing a match against Ajax in Amsterdam. So this really interesting coming together of philo-Semites, pro-Jewish kind of team in the Netherlands for all these weird reasons. And Israelis are soccer crazy. And it's a small country, and as you can imagine, people here have been living under extraordinary pressure for over a year now, and they look for reasons to go to Europe. A few days, chill out, have some fun, and as you said, just make a little holiday of it and have some fun. This one didn't quite turn out as it was planned. We've heard so many conflicting facts and stories, but it seems that by mid-afternoon on Thursday local time in Amsterdam, there was something. There were authorities that knew something might be up. What do you know from your end?
So it's a great question, because some news on that came out last night. So let's separate. Let's talk about sort of what the police did. The police and the authorities in Amsterdam, Halsema, the triangle that I just described, knew that there was a high-risk match. So they asked for a recommendation from the Dutch National Terror Unit. And they said, it's going to be tense because, there's an Israeli team visiting, but no measures other than normal. Maybe call up more police officers, which it did. There were 800 police officers on the street, right? There was a threat of a Palestinian protest near the stadium. That Halsema, to her credit, decided not to let go. She canceled it. She said, not going to be a pro-Palestinian, pro-Hamas rally near the stadium. It's not happening. So it got treated as more or less as sort of a high-risk but regular soccer match with police being there. The Maccabi and Ajax supporters were drinking beer, chanting in the city. They ripped down the Palestinian flag or something happened. There was an altercation with a cab driver. Some things happened, but nothing major, right? So they went to the stadium. The game was played. Ajax won 5-0 over Maccabi, and that was the end of it. And everyone thought that was the end of it, because then the crowds dispersed. They go into the city to have dinner. It was late, right? It was 11 p.m., have a beer. And then, the Maccabi crowds, the crowd disperses. So you have small groups of Israelis walking the streets, clearly identifiable with their, yellow gear and whatever they were wearing. And then the attack started on motorcycles, by cars, also with taxis, targeted attacking the Israelis with random violence. One guy was ran over. There's a video of that where people thrown into the canals. In one hotel, and I heard that yesterday on Dutch TV from the Jewish community, that the gang entered the hotel and asked the front desk, well, where are the Israelis? What room numbers? And they got access to that hotel, and they entered some rooms and beat up some people. Yeah, it's incredible what happened. It was such insane violence that happened all over the city. People were asked for their passports. Are you Jewish? Where are you from? There was one Ukrainian guy who was interrogated. Like, I'm Ukrainian. Well, show me identity papers. And then they let him go. There was a British guy who helped an Israeli support. He was beating up, he had a bloody face. It's a total miracle, Vivian, that we had maybe like 30 or 35 injured people and no fatalities.
There were many people apparently knocked unconscious. We have the spectacle of, I don't even know if it was 2,000 or 3,000 Israelis who were airlifted in emergency flights from Amsterdam yesterday to Israel and coming into the terminal with, clear signs of having been beaten up all over their faces, some walking with difficulty. And the evacuation continues today with El Al, the Israeli national airline, I think for the first time ever flying on the Jewish Sabbath to bring people home. I mean, that's how significant an emergency this is seen to be here. I want to go back to what was going on and what was not going on in the streets. There's plenty of evidence now from chat rooms, from groups, from Telegram channels, from videos that are going viral, that this was not spontaneous. It was planned. It was coordinated. There is evidence that it was being planned the day before.
Or the days before. So apparently, all these activities were organized on Telegram and WhatsApp. And Israeli security services, whether it was the Shin Bet or Mossad, I don't know, had tipped off Dutch authorities earlier. That was on Dutch TV last night, and the Dutch Justice Minister, David Van Wiel, was asked about it. Well, what did you do with that advice? So this was premeditated, it was well organized, and he didn't have an answer for that. He said, well, that information from the Israelis could have landed with the Amsterdam police, it could have landed with national security, it could have landed with some guy in the Justice Department. We are investigating that. That was crucial information.
Crucial. And that is I'm glad you raised it, because that's something that has been sort of seeping into reports. And I hope and expect that it will be clarified and verified this week as a result of the various sittings of politicians in the Netherlands. But what we do know is, notwithstanding the fact that there were, I think you said 800 police officers in the vicinity of this stadium, we do know that the crowds came out. As you said, they were wearing yellow jerseys or yellow scarves, which are the color of Maccabi. And many of them got into the public transit system to get back to their hotels. And this large clump became smaller groups and would disembark public transit to get to their hotels. And that's when the real violence started, when the thugs were able to isolate. So you would have 15, 20 thugs descending on 1, 2, or 3 people. And we've all seen the videos, and they had clubs and they had knives and they had brass knuckles and they had a lot of fists and a lot of legs to kick with. And they caused a lot of damage. You mentioned throwing people into the canal. There were police in the vicinity of these attacks. And there have been more than a few Israelis who have said they begged the police for help, and the police said, there's nothing we can do. Stay in large groups, go back to your hotels. I mean, this literally happened in front of the police.
Correct. Yeah. And you can see that in the videos. And the police was completely, they were prepared for a regular riot, while they should have been prepared for, dispersed violence across the city of Amsterdam. And Amsterdam is a small city. So with a large enough police force that was already on its feet for the game, they could have been deployed. They could have taken appropriate measures, which they didn't do. And they didn't act on the information they had. What's also important to add is that I see sort of in the more critical media saying, well, these Israeli supporters, they brought it onto themselves because, they tore down a Palestinian flag, they abused a taxi driver. Well, even if that were the case, if you could take that argument, the response was, completely inappropriate and, out of bounds. But it wasn't the result of it. It was pre-planned. This was happening on WhatsApp or Telegram or whatever. This was a premeditated attack on Jews. And it was not, the police, the authorities were not prepared for that. So it's important to stick to the facts when all these narratives come out now over the next few days. And you're familiar with that. It's not going to be pretty again in the press. No.
So, and I'm glad you brought that up too, because I was going to raise the so-called provocations. So yes, we've all seen the one video of, an Israeli guy, it seems, man, up on the shoulders of his friend, tearing down a Palestinian flag that's been affixed to the balcony of what seems to be a private home. There's also this viral video of, all these Maccabi fans going down an escalator into public transit and, saying F the Arabs and ugly stuff. And I don't excuse any of it. Having said that, Israeli flags have been burned and torn all over the world, and certainly in Amsterdam and in Toronto and in Vancouver for the last year. Jewish businesses, schools, institutions, all over the Western world have been vandalized and targeted, as have Jewish people. And so I flip the question on anyone who dares to bring up the tearing down of a Palestinian flag as a legitimate reason for this pogrom. And I say, so does that now mean that everyone else can go and like violently attack Muslims everywhere in the West because they tear down not just Israeli flags, Canadian flags too. I'm sure that they, disrespected the Dutch flag.
Well, yeah.
So, I mean, does that then justify a pogrom, hunting them down and beating them up and throwing them in canals? And we both know the answer to that is a resounding no. Aren't different rules. There just aren't, but there are. And that's a horrible thing that we now have to deal with. The other thing that is important is that many of these Israelis and Jews who were trapped and panicked ordered Ubers. When Israelis ordered an Uber, and the Uber drivers, of course, can see the phone number and have the Israeli area code. And they participated by telling the thugs in these organized chat rooms and channels where the Israelis were waiting. And so, often an Uber wouldn't show up, but a gang of thugs did and beat them up.
A lot of Uber drivers have a Muslim background.
I hope that the Netherlands, that the Dutch people step up and really look at what is happening into their society and start to address it. We have games coming up in the near future, I believe in Paris, involving an Israeli team.
Yeah.
And, there's already talk about, these Israelis and Jews, they cause so much trouble. So maybe we just shouldn't have these games, right? Which, of course, would isolate Israel even more in the way that many academics are doing and investment funds. And this is just another piece of that puzzle. It's just cordon off the Jews.
If I can add to that, sort of the discussion this morning on the media and social media is around, okay, we've got a free and liberal society based on laws, but the laws are not sufficient to deal with what we're facing right now. How far are we able or prepared to push back, these constitutional rights and the human rights that are enshrined and that are there to protect us, but they're under such a level of attack that we have to go into different modes to protect ourselves. For instance, the privacy laws prevent a lot of people from interfering in WhatsApp, etc. Right? Well, maybe we have to ditch that, and maybe we have to sort of use extra legal means to avoid these disasters, because worse is going to come. If this can happen, what's next? Right? And I already heard someone saying, there could be a potential October 7th somewhere in Europe.
I agree with you completely. And I would respond in this way that had we in all of these Western liberal countries, including Canada, including the Netherlands, of course, had we actually enforced our laws for the last year, we would not find ourselves in this position. But we didn't. Everyone longed to look the other way. Everyone was terrified of being branded an Islamophobe. Any other identifiable religious, ethnic, national group that would have tried to do in the last year on the streets of liberal democracies what Muslims and pro-Hamas groups have done would have had a very heavy stick come down on them right away. The sad truth is that laws were not enforced. It's not about trampling on human rights or constitutional rights. That's a load of BS. What this is about is pandering to Islamists in society and this sort of herd mentality that has led to so much self-censorship. But now, you say, well, holy crap. And I've been saying this for a long time, that we are now in a position where in every country, it's national security at stake.
I totally agree. So we need politicians who are willing to challenge the status quo and take the necessary action. And we just discussed sort of the right-leaning Dutch government, and we may see that. But even if they go forward on that route, they will be challenged in court. They will be challenged by the European Union. There's an institutional element that you have to overcome. Even the most strong-willed politician will have to deal with that. And that's a process that we're going to see over the next few years if voters, turn more right and are fed up with this stuff. then, they empower the politicians, but it remains to be seen if they can affect the change that we need. And that's separate from the discussion, what does that need to look like? What are we changing? How are we going to live as a society? How are we going to protect ourselves? What sort of laws do we implement? Which laws do we rescind, right?
And also a real reckoning coming to terms with, do these people, not all Muslims, but a large contingent are Islamists, and that's a growing faction. Do they respect our society? Do they have any interest in integrating and in agreeing to our social contract as citizens and how we define ourselves? And if they're not, how are we going to deal with that? Because that's the really big issue, because so many are citizens. So we hear this impulsive kind of populist reaction, deport. Well, no, it's not about deportation. It's now about taking a very hard look at our own societies, actually using the legal tools that we have. So yeah, it gets a little thornier in the Netherlands because of the EU, but that gives us something to talk about in the future, Pieter.
Yeah, great.
Thank you so much. It was just like, I learned a lot. My head's hurting a bit for so many reasons. And I so appreciate you bringing and sharing your expertise with all of our listeners all over the world today.
Thank you very much. Thanks for inviting me, and happy to do it again.
Have a great day.
You too.
Our second interview is with David De Bruijn, the man from The Hague. A superb piece he wrote was in the Free Press on Sunday, and the link is provided in the podcast notes. Having grown up in an environment in which Muslim antisemitism was quite prevalent, David De Bruijn brings an important perspective to this place and time in history. He understands the nuance of homegrown Dutch antisemitism, which is expressed in a much more reserved manner than the violent Muslim variety. But his insight helps to explain why this cancer has metastasized in the Netherlands. Each European country has an interesting and unique history with Jews. De Bruijn understands from whence he came and explains why he chose to leave. David was in class when teachers would introduce Holocaust education modules, and his Muslim classmates would hiss, laugh. They don't care about that history, he says. It has nothing to do with them. They weren't in the Netherlands during the Nazi occupation. No, they come from a culture that has demonized Jews in a most extreme and unrelenting manner, since 1948 at a minimum, but often for much longer. Their anti-Semitism is deeply ingrained. The Dutch, according to De Bruijn, have a tolerant facade, but polite anti-Semitism is prevalent. Today, many Dutch Jews, he says, are discussing whether they have a future in the Netherlands. He explains the complex social circumstances that they have navigated for centuries and concludes that most will likely stay because there is that belief that it will pass. And anyway, where would they go? They are as Dutch as anyone else. They've been there for hundreds of years. But David left because he felt that he did not want to devote his energy to a country and society that was not committed to his safety and dignity. It's Sunday night in Israel, midday where you are. David De Bruijn, professor of philosophy at Auburn University in Alabama. How are you today?
I'm good. Thank you for having me. Great to be here.
Thank you so much for making the time to speak to the State of Tel Aviv. Yeah, 2 hours. All eyes are on Amsterdam these days.
Yeah, in the best way. It's really doing its reputation worldwide.
Yeah, so he's being sarcastic, listeners.
Take it they all have a sense what's going on.
Well, you say that actually sarcastically, David, but in truth, there could be some good that comes out of it. It's obviously, I think, what happened in Amsterdam last Thursday night is horrific. And you are a Dutchman.
True. Can't lie.
I think that the perspective and familiarity that you bring with respect to the situation in the Netherlands, in particular, perhaps in Amsterdam. But as a Jewish man, was once a Jewish child and teenager, growing up in that environment, I think that can help me and our listeners understand what the heck is going on there.
Yeah.
I'd love to hear what it was like growing up in The Hague. You went to public schools. You were in school at a time when the demographics of the Netherlands were changing dramatically. And when I say that, I mean that there were significant numbers of people from Muslim countries, Muslim majority countries, in particular, Morocco and Turkey, moved to the Netherlands.
In the 90s, they were already the group that they currently are. So it must have moved in the 70s and 80s.
Yeah, because I recall when in the 80s, when my parents lived in Amsterdam and I spent an awful lot of time in that fantastic city, the immigration was well underway and the city was definitely starting to change. But it obviously picked up momentum in the 90s and in subsequent years. Tell us what it was like.
Yeah, so I think there's two fundamental sides to it. Holland, as many people will know, 75% of its Jewish population was taken away. The Dutch don't have a great record in resisting all of that. We all know the Anne Frank story. My family survived a sort of similar context, and then the security threats in today's era. So I'm in some sense comfortable with, or this is my natural Jewish experience, that you have to be careful. You have to be very aware of the environment you live in, and you have to be, in my mind, sort of tough-minded about what that means. So in some sense, I wouldn't say I'm desensitized. In a certain sense, I'm sensitized differently. But if you look at it objectively, or when I relate it to other people, as I said, although it is to me normal, they tend to be rather shocked or appalled about certain things. There's one element of this that's just the Dutch society in general. Dutch society is quite cold at heart often, quite willing to be crude, quite tolerant in a merely sort of we'll let you be here, I suppose, kind of way. And so the form that would take would be, for example, that the idiosyncratic phrase cancer Jew is a typical Dutch curse word. It's not applied just to Jews. It's said to many people, especially the police. Football fans use anti-Semitic language to antagonize one another. So the Amsterdam football team has a sort of Jewish history. It's known as the Jewish team. And so that makes other teams sing chants of the form, Hamas, Hamas, all the Jews on gas, or we're hunting for Jews, or the especially lurid. My dad was in the commandos, my mom was in the SS. We like to burn Jews because Jews burn the best. So that's something that would be relatively ordinary in Holland. So it's appalling. And as a child, I remember making a big impression, but it is relatively ordinary as part of life. And then there's the much more serious actual security threats. And that's what we're seeing. That's what we saw in Amsterdam recently, where you have a population, a group of people that also, by the way, is fed. I think it's not unrelated. It's fed in part by this general Dutch crudeness around Jewish existence, right? So it's the fact that the Dutch just use cancer Jew as a curse word fits into what I'm going to talk to, or what I'm getting to, which is that you get a population of people from North Africa, in particular, and Turkey to some degree, for whom palpably there is no real significance to the Jewish story outside of the negative role that they see Jewish people play in Israel. To them, right, the Holocaust is something that is a sort of an abstract concept. Their communities were not in Holland when this happened. And the idea, especially, for example, that Amsterdam has a cherished Jewish past, that it owes its Jews certain things, it doesn't register. And so it's been well documented that educating the Holocaust is becoming nigh impossible in many mixed schools. So you'll see teachers who want to introduce the phrase, right, the Holocaust, and then everyone starts making hissing sounds or laughing, or they'll say things like, you're on the side of the Jews, right? Who would want to be on the side of the Jews in World War II, right? And so that meant for us that you do a lot of security work, for one. So your synagogue will have many layers of protection, often done by the Jewish community itself, but also permanent police protection. So that means, for example, it's not recognizable as a synagogue on the outside. You have to cross through a residential building on the street side to get to a courtyard, after which only you can get to a synagogue. And so there's layers there. And it means that on the street, you cannot, today certainly, you cannot go to significant amounts of neighborhoods and just be like, hey, I'm Jewish. You will not.
I just want to clarify, because we have two very sort of distinct cultures. I think we're talking about the kind of converge on the anti-Semitic stuff. And one would be what I'll call, football or soccer hooligans, which is a very distinct European phenomenon. And, well, it's just not like that in North America. So you have the kind of soccer hooligans. It's a very established culture. It's vulgar, it's violent, and it's widespread across continental Europe and in the UK. Those people who are at the soccer games and, chanting all these awful things, they would tend to be...
It's traditionally the Dutch, the white lower classes. But I think it's a mistake that sometimes I've had this debate where people say, well, why are you bringing that into this? Why is that relevant? Isn't all of what happened in Amsterdam about, let's say, Gaza? First of all, the Dutch, Moroccan, and immigrant lower classes also go into those hooligan fan cultures. It's much more pronounced among the immigrant populations, much more directed against actual Jews. But it is both, violently anti-Semitic.
Absolutely. But I think that it's fascinating that there is this kind of homegrown, if I can put it that way, long-standing Dutch anti-Semitism and proclivity to say and do quite horrible things. And that in some sense has been reinforced by the people who have immigrated, or some of the people who have immigrated to Holland from Morocco and Turkey, who bring with them a much more kind of toxic modern anti-Semitism.
You have, of course, the literal politics, right? The Middle East. Then you have religion, right? So people talk about specifically Islam. And then you have the broader sort of cultural imagination that pervades, or that's part of where these people came from. We're unaware the degree to which, the Dutch certainly are totally unaware of this, the degree to which, the supposed new European political life grounded in the post-war consciousness, which says the Jews have undergone the most unique form of suffering in history. The Allies liberated us, right? So that is not the world that these communities came from. They were in North Africa. They were often in societies that preferred the Nazis over the British, right? The Nazis in North Africa were arriving, claiming, offering, promising to liberate Arab populations from British rule. The British are not the good guys in their imagination, much less that their focus is on Dutch Jewish suffering in Amsterdam. To them, the Jews entered the story in 1948, and how they got there and why exactly, who knows, but it's wrong, right? And I think the Dutch are not aware that they are dealing with a cultural imagination, but I think it's primarily this fact that they don't care. In that imagination, the Holocaust is as relevant as the Dutch Golden Age or the Middle Ages. It's some type of weird abstract past that they weren't there for.
And when we're talking about at the moment, this population, this segment of Dutch society, we're talking about Muslims who, for the most part, again, came from Morocco and Turkey. But those who were out there with their brass knuckles and knives and wood planks hunting Jews on Thursday night, I'm going to speculate that probably 99% of them were born in the Netherlands.
Oh, well, certainly there will be very few recent immigrants, yeah. So We're talking about the immigrant street culture. Think about youth gangs. It has come to dominate urban, poor neighborhoods in Holland. And so it's second and third generation, perhaps sometimes even fourth generation immigrants. It's not that these people just arrived. No, it's kids who don't have structure growing up at home. The Dutch criminal system is unbelievably lenient, right? I always joke that if you do a real bad thing, as that happened in Amsterdam recently, the punishment is likely to be no pocket money for the next month and, less time on the PlayStation. That's the sort of, and so they use that to dominate streets in their neighborhoods, do various sort of thuggish behaviors. And you can ask them, this happens in the media often, any time of the day, for example, what they think about gay people, and you'll get the most lurid invectives. Yeah, that's the situation.
So we have this outbreak of violence on Thursday night. We now know, based on text messages, that some of which have been disclosed, not all, but Dutch police and authorities in Israel, and I think others, have confirmed that there are various Telegram groups, WhatsApp groups. I think it was disclosed today that there was a WhatsApp group with 700 or 800 people on it.
The news keeps arriving, but
Yes.
The basic picture is, so a lot of this seems to have been driven also by the taxi driver population in Amsterdam, which is known to be extremely mired in criminal behavior. Amsterdam is a huge crime scene. Taxi drivers are largely from these immigrant communities. Many books have been written on calling, the taxi mafia. They appear to have been coordinating this, sending group text, group WhatsApp, and apparently also group Uber, but things like that, yeah.
And based on what you know, the organizing of this attack began Tuesday, Wednesday?
I can't speak to this research that's unfolding, the actual investigation. My sense is that it's probably weeks, because they know weeks ahead of time that the Amsterdam team will be playing this Israeli team. And that's also why, right, a lot of attention has been given to this idea that the Tel Aviv fans in the day during the game, right, got up to hooligan activity, and this somehow provoked this activity. And there are absolutely chants that I think are both incredibly inappropriate in general and immoral, but also unbelievably unwise to be bringing to Europe. And on an occasion or two, I believe they stole a flag or someone, although frankly, if you've been to any of these pro-Palestinian demonstrations, stealing flags is roughly all they do. So the fans who were attacked were not those fans. The fans who were attacked were much later, were oftentimes parents and their kids, girls literally were just attending. And even if no hooligan had done anything on behalf of Maccabi, this would have happened because it was pre-planned.
It is extraordinary just how quickly the world rushes to blame the Jews. Your point is very well taken that we've all seen that shot of an escalator going down into public transit, and it's full of Maccabi. It's solid Maccabi fans. You can tell because they're all dressed in yellow and with yellow scarves, and they are shouting really violent and racist anti-Arab chants. There's no question. And it's deplorable behavior. And we've all seen the film of a Palestinian flag being torn down, and I've not seen it being burned, but maybe it was. But again, your point, all really ugly, reprehensible, bad behavior, worse than bad, but it just does not justify the response in any measure.
But it doesn't even explain, it wasn't a response.
Exactly.
It was not a response, right?
Sorry, let me rephrase that. If it was a response, it would not justify that response, but it was not a response.
Exactly.
It's just extraordinary how media and interest groups and people everywhere in the world, not just in Holland, are trying to say, well, the Jews kind of...
Yeah, so I'm inclined to say, this says something, I guess, I don't know if it's good or bad. It is how I am. I'm inclined to say it's not astonishing. Like, it is precisely like that. And what surprised me most about the whole event was that these Maccabi fans went by their thousands to Amsterdam without security. I mean, I don't mean because they did chant horrible things and so forth, but not because of them doing something wrong. I find it incomprehensible. I was like, are you not aware what place you're going to here? So no, I don't find it surprising. I find it typical. I said, no, they would not, in no other situation. In fact, after 9/11, of course, right, and that is a crime of proportions that there's no dialogue about in the way there is about the Middle East. No, we've spent years making very clear that this is not something you take out on local Muslims. They are unrelated.
So you're not surprised at all, and totally understand kind of where you're coming from. And I also understand when you say, what's with these Israelis? Because I think we both have some familiarity with Israeli society. And you have over 3,000 Maccabi Tel Aviv fans going for, a few days of fun and mayhem in Amsterdam. to hang out and watch their team play. But there is remarkably an obliviousness, I think, on the part of Israelis with respect to how anti-Semitism manifests outside of Israel and how widely it is tolerated and normalized.
Yeah, and it's ironic because anti-Semitism is something that Israelis are likely to talk about, and yet they don't seem to have the sort of feeling in the tips of their fingers for the reality of it.
I think that sixth sense is something that those of us who grew up in diaspora communities are much more sharply attuned to. You mentioned government, so I want to just kind of move into that because, of course, we're both very aware of the shock horror expressed by the King of Holland.
Oh, yeah, right.
And there is an emergency session of the legislature convening to discuss this issue. There is an emergency meeting of, I think, the civic leaders in Amsterdam, the municipal leaders, and I'm sure there are lots of other emergency meetings going on as well. What do you think this all says and means? They're going to sit down and they're going to have some earnest discussions and, articulate well-meaning, reflective resolutions about how we must never let this happen again, and that'll be that? Or do you think this might actually mark a turning point in the Netherlands?
Good question. So for one, I would say even those bits of language, like the King was shocked and there's all these emergency meetings, I would say, yeah, one wants to hear that in a very attenuated way. The King knows, and the King is a good guy, right? There's nothing wrong with him. But that language, we are shocked. We we didn't help Holland's Jews in World War II, and now again, yeah, those are phrases that they should say, right? Similarly, emergency meetings, emergency sessions, those are items you can put on a bureaucratic agenda. They love that. So in principle, I would say, no, what they'll do is they'll hem and haw over the details of everything. So they will say, well, we're still studying the event, and in this neighborhood, it seems like the Tel Avivans did this, and then how could the police? We told them to put 500 people, but they put 400 people. And then in general, right, and they'll be, well, we have to do a study of at least 2 years to, what went wrong with the police deployment of this, that, and the other. And then they'll do that. The problem is these communities that are out there on the streets who you can ask. I mean, this is not new. I said, you can ask them any day of the week. You can just go up to them and you can ask, what do you think of Jews? And they say, oh, I think they should be stabbed. So this is not the new. But then the thing is, so what should we do? And their answers, the Dutch are just such like any type of decisive action is to them anathema. And so their answer is extremely limited. The $2 consists of a subsidy for Holocaust awareness education, to which I would say, no, they're aware of the Holocaust. They don't care or they like it. So this is not something they're like, well, remarkable. Add Frank, you say. Well, in that case, right? The second is interfaith dialogue. Visit a community center where the community leaders of these groups of people, these people don't have leaders. There's some type of 60-year-old person who's leading the neighborhood center, and they'll get them to say, we're appalled. Irrelevant, right? And then there'll be things about the youth. These youths need another neighborhood center because they're bored, and that's the problem. We can send in what they call neighborhood fathers, and that would be like someone, sort of a half police officer who gets to chat and goes on the street and says, hey, cut that out. And by and large, nothing will happen. Now, it is possible this government is much, much more right-wing. Rhetorically, it is a coalition government. So it is possible that somehow this event changes. They start doing things. They start passing laws. Do I think it's likely? Absolutely not. For example, right here's one example. As I said, the Dutch justice system doesn't really punish people. You can murder someone and it is not at all inconceivable. You're out in 2 years. Now, people say, but this is, of course, the sort of well-known kind of way of thinking, well, studies show that punishing people and incarcerating them, it doesn't help because after they come out, they're no less likely to fall back into crime. And I always say, well, while they're in, they can't do crime. So, if they're in jail for 10 years, that's already 8 years more that they can't be doing any crimes. The Dutch sort of judicial elite does not seem to find that persuasive. So it is possible that they would change it, but I think it's very unlikely. They usually think every possible answer to a problem like this is impossible. It would be against basic principles of the Dutch legal system.
It's fascinating because as we're discussing now, and we spoke earlier today as well, the similarities between the Dutch mindset, the institutional mindset and approach to these issues, and what prevails in Canada these days, it's just like copy-paste, remarkably similar. And one of the things I just want to pick up on that you mentioned a few minutes ago is, Holocaust education, right?
Right.
So what the federal government in Canada has done is lots of noise and budgets and created these special offices. One is the chief envoy for combating antisemitism, and the other is a chief envoy for combating Islamophobia. I think that just the mere fact that these offices have been created is appalling. I think the government should do its job, and entrenching this sort of identity politics is really irresponsible and not helpful. And what's interesting is that the chief envoy for combating anti-Semitism, a former professional diplomat with long experience and highly regarded, but interestingly is not Jewish. And it's so ironic because in this age of identity politics, the government of Prime Minister Justin Trudeau would never dare to appoint anyone other than a Muslim to run Islamophobia. But that kind of fork aside, her office, the Office of the Chief Envoy, has been focused for over a year on producing a handbook that has helpful writing and guidance about the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, and also spends lots of time promoting Holocaust education. And my view is we're 50 years too late on that. We're in 2.0 now. Why are you doing this? What point is there? And you lived it. You're saying you lived it when they were trying to teach the Holocaust.
Oh, yeah. The teaching of it was always, it's a misdiagnosis. Like I said, it's not a lack of information. We're so used to thinking World War II, that's the Holocaust, right? We all know the Spielberg movies. It's the Holocaust, that's the Allies versus the Axis, main problem, Hitler, right? And we're so used to that is just the only way that anyone would think about it that way, that if you ended up being especially insensitive or in favor of Jewish suffering, you must not know about this or something. But like I've been saying, no, these groups of people do not share that basic frame. They do know about it. They have the opposite frame. Now, not explicitly, again, these people are not reading books about the 40s by and large or have any ideas about this, but they have no sympathy at the word, and then came the Americans and the English and they freed Europe. They have no care for, and then the Jewish people were liberated from the camps. If you did, you would understand. You could have any political view, but you at least understand in a basic empathetic way, the way, frankly, I do and everyone, so many people do have a certain empathy with the Nakba and stuff. You would understand why Israel's there. You would understand what the Jewish people went through. You would try to solve these political issues with a broad mind. And so the thing is, for the longest time, to some degree, initially, I'm sure innocently, the idea was, well, they must not know about it, so let's tell them about Anne Frank. But the truth is, it's been clear by now for a long time, they don't care. You could tell them all the facts. That is not interesting to them, right? And then the fact is, and that's also why there are offices and envoys, as you say, exactly as you say in Canada. If you don't want to press the buttons that work, you'll just want to press the buttons that don't work because they're buttons, right? And that is what they're doing. You can all, the problem with this, and it's in many ways, this is not a unique phenomenon. I think this is quite widespread in Western democracies, is the problem and the solution, they're in many ways too simple and too straightforward to solve for a Western democracy. The problem is so obvious that a Western democracy cannot comfortably look it in the face. It much prefers something really complicated and, well, there's just so many nuances. We must set up 17 committees, right? No, the problem is entirely obvious. You have a large group of people who roam the streets and prefer Jews die. It's not more complicated. That's what you got to address. But as I said, Western democracies are uncomfortable even thinking of that there could be such a simple problem.
Your family is still largely, I understand, living in, right, as you said earlier, you put your family in The Hague and in Amsterdam. I'm assuming that you've had some contact with them in the last few days.
Oh, definitely, yeah.
So tell us how they're reacting to what's going down.
Yeah, so it's interesting. So one thing I think that is helpful to be aware of, also certainly from an Israeli perspective, and I'm very aware of that perspective, right? It's the idea of like, why are these people still here? Like the degree, we've been in Holland, my family comes from Spain, and we've been in Holland for 4 centuries. The degree to which their lives are interwoven with very specific Dutch cultural distinctions and features that shape their lives. So, right, both my brother and my sister are lawyers in the Dutch system. Right, that's just irrelevant if you're no longer working in Holland, right? So the degree to which it's hard for people to leave, and they will, even despite what they recognize as horrible, somehow live in a society that treats them that way. My mother is very much along my lines, but I think it's psychologically harder for people of my generation, my siblings, to acknowledge, right? Yeah, there is a fundamental, like this society is to some good degree fundamentally unfriendly to Jews. And there is a degree of threat of violence. You'd prefer to, they too, to some degree, would prefer if we could start a committee. No.
Right. You said that your mom kind of is more aligned with the way you tend to look at these things.
Well, I decided quite early. So this is a very personal thing, of course, for every Jewish person in this kind of situation. I decided quite early that my family survived by being in hiding. My grandfather's brother went to Israel. I could not quite understand why. I could understand, but I could not quite share, so to say, or endorse why my family had stayed in Holland. If 75% of Jewish people have been killed, what are you going to do now? And so I quite early on decided, it's not that I'm afraid. I frankly, as I said, I'm used to that. But I don't want to live. I don't want to work for a society. I don't want to put my talents at the disposal of a society that refuses to protect Jewish people after the Holocaust. And so it's not that I live in Alabama. It's not that I left to say in a one-to-one corresponding sense to that, but it always motivated me to a good degree, think about Israel, think about other places. Look, this is not going, I don't see the Dutch changing this. Why would I try to do my best for a society that I have no faith in, right? I don't have faith in how they think about it. And that actually is a Dutch native problem. So it's interesting in many ways, right? The problem is, of course, with these communities that perpetrated this attack, but in many ways, the lack of faith applies even more to the Dutch governing elite. They won't solve it. You cannot rely on them. They will not protect you.
And from what you're saying, it sounds like it's a very, bureaucratic, somewhat rigid, kind of cold in a way, or guarded. It's very similar to what the culture is in Canada. Very bureaucratic, very institutional. They love committees.
I'll give you an example. I do a podcast in Dutch on just American society and politics. And I do it with, a nice guy, a recent friend of mine who goes on Dutch TV and talks about, Trump and all that. And for many times it comes up, and certainly also in the way he's thinking about it, things like Charlottesville, right? Remember, can you believe he said there are good people on both sides? And when actual Jews are being hunted in those terms in Amsterdam, in the city that he lives, he finds it all too nuanced to say anything about it. Well, I can't really tell what happened. That doesn't make any sense. Like, I supposed to take seriously a discussion about Charlottesville when they said, right, Jews will not replace us. But when push comes to shove, all the Dutch people I know, they find it too hard and nuanced to be like, well, maybe the North Africans shouldn't be hunting for Jews. That's not my kind of project. I like being part of, for example, the project here. I have a little more faith in it.
I'm sure you still have contact with old friends who are Jewish and still living in the Netherlands, and possibly younger family members, nieces and nephews. What are they talking? How are they feeling? Are they looking around and thinking, holy crap, I'm not sticking around for this. This is not our first rodeo.
Yeah, I would say in the Jewish community at large, outside of my family, if I just, maybe not even people that I know very closely, that sentiment is somewhat present of, do we have a future here? Though, as I said, if you were hearing about all this, you would probably underrate and underestimate the amount of Jews that will find a way to put it in a box and sort of go, well, it's those kids from those neighborhoods, and yeah, I wish someone did something about it. Okay, let me get back to my job. So there's a lot of worry, but there's also, I said the Dutch Jews are also, of course, Dutch. So we also like to nuance things and hem and haw. Well, on the one hand, so I think there's a good bit of that, to be honest with you. I also don't think, for example, that will truly change And then the question is, at what point would it change? What if a bomb explodes? And this was, of course, these events, they were mostly involved hunting Israelis. But what if they do attack a Jewish school? Will something change then? And again, I think a lot would have to happen for Dutch Jews to fundamentally say, hey, we're not doing this.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. They were hunting Israelis and asking for passports. They were also running around the streets saying, find the Jews, get the Jews.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, I think that for large parts of this particular culture, Jews and Israelis and Zionists are interchangeable terms.
Oh, definitely. It's just in this case, what I meant is this event happened around this football match. And so de facto, it didn't end up, it wasn't like they attacked just a synagogue service. But they could, and you're exactly right. They don't have a distinction there. It's not that they go, excuse me, no, don't beat up this guy. This one's just a Dutch Jew. We like those. No.
We've had the fire bombings, we've had the shootings, we've had it all. And you know what? It's just, people are kind of like, okay, let's put out another handbook on the Holocaust.
I would say it's exactly comparable. And I think from Canada, what I've seen is there's been a new reality that really does feel more European than it does North American, which is what was a classic distinction. And
yeah, well, Canada is much more European in my view than American. It's North American, but
yes,
I think that the culture overall is closer to what we find in Western Europe than what we find in America. We sound the same, but we're not so much the same.
Yeah, I could see that. That.
Well, David, thank you so much for sharing so openly.
Thank you. It's something that, it's very good to be able to freely think about it with someone like you without this kind of, while we're trying to do an actual attempt to address things or in your mind, as opposed to, oh, right, when things like this happen, one says these phrases and then let's hope it goes away or something.
I'm going to be keeping an eye on the situation because, as you know, I'm quite attached to Amsterdam and to the Netherlands. And I think this is an important kind of nodal point. No matter what happens, I think keeping an eye on it and seeing how it is treated and develops, it's important and will tell us something about what may come. So I'm sure I'll be coming back to you.
Definitely. I'll be listening.
And thank you so much for making time to talk to us today.
Thank you. It was great.
Our third and final interview today is with Eitam Zach, a 27-year-old Israeli man who I connected with through my daughter, same age. Zach completed his mandatory army service and left Israel soon after, not in a huff, but more to pursue his academic and professional interests. He has completed 2 university degrees in the Netherlands and is now considering his next steps. Eitam Zach is young, queer, and feels a strong something, a shift in society. He identifies positive surprises as well as disturbing ones. And overall, at the moment, he is uncertain about so much. He is ambivalent when asked if he feels safe in Amsterdam. A young, queer Israeli man who finds himself in the midst of a hot mess of hatred that seems to snare the Jews every 50 years or so, somewhere in the world. Monday late morning in Israel, a little earlier in Amsterdam, where you are, Eitam Zach. Thank you so much for making time to speak with State of Tel Aviv.
Thank you for having me.
So it's been quite a time in Amsterdam. You're an Israeli, and you've been living there for 5.5 years now, right?
Correct. 5.5 years. Can't believe myself, but yes.
And you've studied 2 degrees, one at the Hague and one at the University of Amsterdam, and now are going to launch your career in some form of political, NGO-related communications.
Hopefully, yes.
What I want to focus on, of course, is it was almost really a week ago that this fiasco began. And when I say fiasco, I would refer to what many are calling the Amsterdam pogrom, which took place last Thursday night and in the early hours of Friday. And we know that about 3,000 Israeli Tel Aviv Maccabi fans kind of made their way to Amsterdam for a 3-4 day holiday, a match against the local Amsterdam team, which is iconic and famous and fabulous. But things kind of went awry. Why don't you tell us what you know about what's been going on there since last Tuesday?
So it's important to say I wasn't part of, I did not go to the game myself, but I did know about the game and did definitely see the videos on social media. Definitely it felt like the atmosphere in the city is quite tense. I mean, I think for many of us, we kind of felt like something is coming. It is an amplification of something that we felt over a year by now since the war has begun, that there's a lot of tension, there's a lot of hostility towards Israel and Israelis, which I'll get to in a bit later. And then definitely, as we all know, the sort of like the peak of this, the boiling point of this situation was the night where Dutch citizens of Moroccan and Turkish descent were attacking Israelis. Now we already know, as of yesterday, it was announced by the local police that this was a planned attack, not just a spontaneous attack. So this was already known. They planned this some time in advance, and they were looking for groups of Israelis around town that night because they knew there will be. So yeah, I think like many of other people in Amsterdam right now, many Israelis, but not only Israelis, it's important to say, I think we're all feeling a bit overwhelmed. You could really feel this weekend in Amsterdam, the atmosphere was not the same. Yes, it's a cold November. Yes, it was 4 or 5 degrees outside, but it doesn't usually stop Amsterdammers from going out, living their best life. This is a very hedonistic city, and you could really feel like it's discussed everywhere. I can tell you, even I'm going to a group that's called Queer Sobers, which is a sober queer club, essentially, and they meet occasionally. And this Friday, we had a very intimate meeting, and it really felt like it's the elephant in the room. And then people know I'm Israeli, of course, and it was a very diverse room. There was a lesbian girl from Ukraine, and there was an Italian guy, there was a Spanish guy, and then I asked the people in the room, guys, what do you feel about what happened last night? And then people just opened up, and you could really feel like people were feeling really ashamed. And I got some text messages from Dutch friends apologizing for what happened, even though they didn't partake, because they said, so close to Crystal Night. So yeah, I can say, reporting from Amsterdam, that it has been a very intense time in the city, and you could feel something off.
It's interesting because you said that there was just this feeling of tension building before the match. And many people have commented on that. Can you just sort of elaborate on what you personally felt or sensed in those days leading up to the match?
I just remember, or what I felt was, I see a lot of this content on social media. Obviously, there was a lot of backlash already against the game itself, because so many people here, especially in Amsterdam, which represents, let's say, the very left, queer, et cetera, anti-Israel side of the Netherlands, people were very much against the game. So you already felt that on social media, a lot of posts against the game, about the game. And then I think the incidents that happened with the fans, with the Israeli soccer fans prior to the game, I think many people felt that it's going to blow up. It's already a topic around town. People are already mad. They're looking for an excuse. It's going to blow up. And it did. So I think there was this really feeling that something's going to happen. At least I felt it.
Yeah, well, there seemed to be others. It wasn't just you. And, I don't think that I'm certainly not, and I don't know anyone personally who is excusing the behavior of some of the Israeli fans. Having said that, we've seen it all over the world that the flag of Israel has been torn, burned, stomped on, desecrated over and over for well over a year under the eyes of local police in so many places. Jewish people and Israelis have been targeted violently. And I know that in Canada, the Canadian flag has been desecrated. I have spoken to people in the Netherlands who say the Dutch flag has been desecrated repeatedly over the past year at these so-called peaceful protests. So on the one hand, I'm not excusing any soccer racist, hooligan, bad behavior. But there is a big difference between behaving like a soccer hooligan and shouting racist chants and roaming the streets in an organized fashion, looking for Jews to beat up, and doing so with the open assistance we now know of taxi and Uber drivers, some hotel receptionists, and as the police just kind of stood around and did nothing. So I just want to make clear to you and to our listeners that I'm not making excuses, but I think that to equivocate and even suggest that there's some sort of parity in the context is wrong. It's morally and factually wrong.
And it's important to say, and I think, I don't know if people know this, but first of all, I think we both know that this would have happened regardless of the chance or whatever. This would have happened. This was not preventable. This would have happened. Like, this attack would have taken place. Of course, if the police was doing its job, the outcome would not have been as harsh, but this would have happened. But it really feels like when it's Jews, there's always an excuse, right? And that's definitely it. Yeah, the chants are not okay. We're not excusing that. But as someone from the queer sober group said, there's a big difference between chants and tearing down symbols to actually beating up people and trying to kill people and stabbing people. And we should, sort of separate. Both are wrong, but the severity is just immensely different. And I really admired her words because she's from the Ukraine. She kind of clarified she's very not pro-Israel in the war, but she was like, this is inexcusable. Chanting and tearing up flags is not, there's no comparison even. And I agree, obviously.
Yeah, and that's really interesting. And as we know, all too well, the Jews are first, but definitely not last. And there will be other targets who will be facing this sort of wrath and violence if Western societies don't kind of find a way to manage and control it. So you had an interesting weekend. I know that all protests in Amsterdam were prohibited. There were no demonstrations allowed. And there's this kind of, Dutch sort of sense of emergency or state of emergency. And I say that because, as we both know, the Dutch they are renowned for being tolerant, and they love talking about tolerance. It's just kind of in their DNA. So to prohibit protests is for them quite extreme. And this week we have emergency sessions in the parliament there, emergency meetings of the mayor's office and various justice-related and municipal committees. And this is quite unprecedented, as well as the fact that the king came out, immediately in a telephone call with President Herzog of Israel and said,
that's a statement. Yeah.
That's a big deal when the King of the Netherlands makes such a very unequivocal and powerful statement. Did that come up with you and your friends either at Queer Sober Night or elsewhere?
The king doesn't often come out with that political or grandiose statements. Definitely not something like, we let down the Jews and the Holocaust and today again. I think that's unprecedented for sure. So it's important to say this just shows how much they take it seriously, which I do appreciate. They're learning their lessons. I do think Dutch people are very slow when it comes to, if there's something I learned here during COVID as well, they're very slow when it comes to implementing and making conclusions out of things. They're very slow because that's the way they work. They're very thorough people. They like to really look at every situation analytically, see what went wrong, talk about it, hear so many different experts, and then months after they will come with a conclusion and implement it next year. Then that's the Dutch way to do things. So in a way, sometimes, especially as we're Israeli, we're very used to things happening here and now, right? So yeah, going back to the king definitely shows how seriously they take that. And I also thought it was a really big statement that the king doesn't often talk about what's happening.
Yeah, it is quite rare, exceptionally rare, I would say. Other people I've spoken to and with whom I've corresponded who either are from the Netherlands or living there now, they're a little bit sanguine and reflective about where this all goes for the reasons you suggest, that the Dutch tend to, engage or make change very carefully. Having said that, there's enough of an historical memory in the Netherlands to recall what happened. There are still people alive who went through it. And I believe that country has been shaken to its core in some ways and cannot justify it. The question is going to be, what do they do about it? And we have some community leaders, and one in particular who has been asserting that, we all know the Zionists planned this, the usual playbook. It's the Mossad and the Shin Bet. They planned it because they need to generate sympathy because, they don't have public opinion on their side in Europe. So this is kind of like an inside job. Again, the denial. So maybe it happened, and if it happened, it's justified. And, who wouldn't do that to Israelis and Jews who are horrible racists and oppressors? Do you have any contact there with, the Israeli community or the Jewish community, or are you kind of a lone wolf out there?
I'd say I'm a lone wolf generally, especially now. I'm now at university, so I'm a little bit yes, on my own. But definitely, I've spoken to some Israelis, and I think we all feel a bit shocked about the situation. You could really feel, especially with some friends that I spoke with this weekend about the situation. We're all still processing it a little bit because I think it's on top of the war and on top of the hostility we feel here for so long. I do feel like everyone is sort of processing this. It's a lot. And I do feel especially being in Israel or abroad, and I feel that's many Israelis, because I have many Israeli friends who live abroad in Paris and in London and in the US, we all feel a bit lonely in those difficult times. So this kind of sort of adds to that. But I can tell you that it feels in a way, I feel this was sort of an affirmation that I'm not insane, because I've been feeling for so long in Amsterdam that particularly in Amsterdam, I felt that the hostility is through the roof. It's more than in other places where I felt because I live in Europe. I've been to London this year. I've been to Paris. I've been to, many big cities. There's something about Amsterdam that I just felt is off. How much people deal with the war here, and how much people have this I really felt this anger and hate towards Israel.
Do you feel safe?
Safe in theory. Yes, I feel safe. But I will say that, and that's something I told people from the beginning of the war. Yes, I feel safe personally, but seeing people on social media and people I used to call friends justifying October 7th and saying these awful things comparing Zionism to Nazism. And Vivian, I really want to stress this, that these are some of those people, one of my closest friends here, posting all these awful things about Israel that are beyond just an opinion about the politics. It's just really, I feel hate speeches about Israel and Jews.
Was this particular friend sort of set off by the Thursday night pogrom, or has this friend been making these sorts of comments on social media since October 7th?
October 7th, and then after the pogrom, I saw some posts excusing it, minimizing it, saying it wasn't that the numbers are Zionist propaganda. So I feel safe personally. I just feel this is a weird situation to be in. People excusing, because you could have been one of those victims, and seeing your people you used to call friends justifying it and justifying so many awful things that happen right now. I'm safe, but not safe, if that makes sense.
I take it that this person is not someone you consider to be a friend any longer. Well, Eitam, thank you so much for sharing your time and your thoughts and experience.
Sure. Thank you for having me.
And stay safe, huh?
Thank you.
And that, my listeners, is a wrap. Thank you for being here. I am officially obsessed with what is unfolding in Amsterdam and now ricocheting throughout Europe and Canada, where I come from. If you do not already do so, please consider supporting our work with a paid subscription. Me and my team are pouring our hearts, souls, and significant effort and time into these podcasts. If you are listening, then we must be doing something right. In the meantime, stay safe. And thanks again for being here. You can follow us on Instagram at State of Tel Aviv, all one word, or on X at State of TLV, all one word. We love hearing from you, so please comment on our website, stateoftelaviv.com, or send us a note to hello@stateoftelaviv.com. On behalf of the State of Tel Aviv core team, Jan Szabo, our creative, graphic, visual, and marketing man, Amir White, producer and editor extraordinaire, sound guy, who is also impressively patient with me and my boomer tech deficiencies, and our social media manager who pitches in on everything, Maya Naftalin. Thanks to the team. Thanks to you for being here. We'll be back soon.